Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole for January 8th. Happy New Year. Kicking it off. Welcome to the Squamish Nation Traditional Territory, Clapham, Squalin, Lillooet, Squamish, or Mayo. We have an amended agenda before us. I added to the discussion for the projects and initiatives update, the average speed over distance, which was an initiative of Lions Bay during the last council. Just wanted to have an opportunity to update council on that. So, motion to approve the amended agenda. Moved by Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Race. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. So, first up is our regional growth strategy discussion. There is a memo bylaw before us. And this is just really about feedback today, isn't it? We're not passing a motion. So I'll turn it over to that.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Gunn, planner for the District of Squamish. Today we're speaking about the regional growth strategy review that is underway. The district has received a courtesy referral following second reading by the SLRD board. And I do want to thank a couple councillors who have provided some questions in advance of this meeting. I have added that content to the presentation, so there is some content here that isn't covered in the report to council. And I am going to do a little bit of a review. We did talk previously about regional growth strategies, but I do just want to do a very quick review about the structure of those. And then a bunch of this presentation is actually about what has happened leading up to this point, so that there's context for councillors that were not on council last term. So the intention of a regional growth strategy is to direct long-term planning for the regional district in order to promote human settlement that is socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. Development of an RGS is initiated, prepared, and enacted by the regional district with the involvement of its member municipalities as well as provincial agencies and corporations. Before adoption, an RGS must be accepted by all members of the regional district, and if there is a problem with getting acceptance by all members of the regional district, there is a mediated settlement process that's identified in the LGA. RGSs are similar in structure and content to an OCP. The current RGS that we have is organized into 9 goals, which are listed on the screen, as well as supporting strategic directions. And our RGS also includes a settlement planning map, a set of settlement planning maps. And these are similar to land use designation maps in our OCP that identify areas for settlement and non-settlement. When an RGS applies to a municipality, the municipal OCP must include a regional context statement, or RCS. Our RCS, sorry, our I hope this is not a tone for this meeting. There are many 3-letter acronyms that are fairly similar. Our OCP includes an RCS. The RCS identifies the relationship between the OCP and the RGS, and the OCP must be consistent with the RCS. There isn't a requirement that our OCP is consistent with the regional growth strategy. The requirement is that we are consistent with our RCS, which is within our OCP. And the RCS must identify how the OCP will become consistent with the RGS over time. So that's the structure in the Local Government Act. Our OCP has to comply with our RCS, and that shows how we become consistent with the RGS over time.
Can we just pause there?
Yes, absolutely.
Everyone, that crystal clear? We're good?
Yeah, if at any point there's any request for clarification, please do not hesitate, because this is somewhat, yes.
Now you should be clear about it. Okay, Councillor Race.
And what happens if it isn't?
Which aspect? If it is not?
If we change the OCP so it was not consistent with the RCS, so if we changed it and our RCS said we might make it consistent 10 years from now, and it's not accepted by the regional district board, what are the consequences of that?
Okay, so there's several things going on in what you asked about. So if we make a change to our OCP that is not in line with the RGS, then we would need to make a change to our RCS because we need to be consistent with the RCS, depending on how our RCS is structured. And then that would get submitted to the regional district. The regional district then, for it to accept the RCS, it goes to all of the member municipalities, and all the member municipalities and the regional board must accept it. So everybody has to agree that it becomes, that it is an appropriate document. And if the RCS is not accepted by everyone in the RGS, all the member municipalities and the electoral area directors, then we could wind up in a arbitration process again, or a settlement process. It follows the same process in terms of acceptance as the RGS. There has to be acceptance, and there's an arbitration option if we cannot all agree on what those RCSs should say. Does that answer that question?
And the result of that would be either it would be accepted or not accepted, which then would mean would come back then to the municipality to amend their OCP to be consistent.
That's right. If it was not accepted, then we would be in violation of the Local Government Act because our RCS was not consistent with our OCP, and since we couldn't change our RCS, we would have to change our OCP. Hopefully we don't wind up there. Okay, so the current RGS was developed between 2004 and 2010. In 2008, as part of that process, the Squamish Council actually objected to the RGS. There were concerns from the District of Squamish about insufficient public consultation, lack of clarity in enforcement of the agreement, lack of clarity in the amendment process, and acceptance of the RGS prior to our OCP being adopted, which could then be prejudicial to our OCP. So there are a number of concerns. Largely, these concerns reflected concerns around autonomy. There was another level of control that could influence decision-making in the district, and there was concern around that autonomy. Ultimately, the issues around that were resolved through binding arbitration, and unfortunately, they were concluded in the favor of the SLRD. We were not successful in that. Yes.
Yeah, and let me comment on that because I was here and somebody else raised that point. So I got on council at the end of 2008, and in 2009, this was sort of front and center, was our first significant issue. And we had that impasse. Squamish was the one outstanding vote to make the thing carry on. We went through an electorate area forum. We actually had a meeting with the ministry right here, the SLRD staff and our staff and some elected officials, and went through the issues we had with them. That prompted the chair of the SLRD at the time to call an elected officials forum with a mediator. And so we went through the mediation portion of it. And out of that, we came to a consensus that we wanted local autonomy. Others hadn't quite realized that there was such a loss of autonomy. And so we got kind of a consensus there, but we couldn't just change it because what we identified at that point, and the legislation's changed slightly since, I'm not sure if it's the same, but it's not like a zoning bylaw where we can amend it after first reading or second reading. There was no provision for amending in the middle of the process. We would have had to go back to square one and start the whole referral process again with all the surrounding regional districts, First Nations, etc. And at that point, I remember the comment one director made, they were about $1 million into this process. And nobody had an appetite for that. And the one exception that will change the bylaw going forward is an arbitrator's order. So we ended up with almost a consent arbitration. And I say that because at the point where it was a final position arbitration, it was everybody put their position down and the arbitrator just selected one. But I know the directors of planning for the regional district, for Whistler, for Squamish, were kind of consulting with each other and kind of getting it, and they're all slightly different because the ministry didn't like that idea of consent arbitration. And the regional district one was selected. Frankly, at that point, there was really no difference. And so we ended up doing that, but it was really done to allow the amendment in the middle of the process. And then we went to third reading. So at that point, it was collaborative, not confrontational.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. And to be honest, I've tried to go back and understand, and not having that insight, I don't think I had that level of understanding, so I appreciate you clarifying that. And in the end, I had just put up the difference between what the District of Squamish and what the SLRD had presented to the arbitrator, and it really was about the applicability of some of this policy language to all OCPs in the regional district versus just electoral areas. And I think that's the one difference that existed between SLRD and Squamish, and it was determined by the arbitrator that this policy would apply to all OCPs. But I think what Councillor Race is pointing out is probably the most important piece. We'll move on. Okay, so in February 2016, the SLRD board initiated a review of the RGS with the intent to meet LGA requirements. They are required to be updated on a regular basis. Also, in that review, it's intended to improve implementation of the RGS and to evolve the policy. The review has included proposed changes to the minor amendment process, which I'll talk to in just a minute. The review also includes, from the District of Squamish's standpoint, an update to settlement planning area in the maps in the RGS for Squamish and for other communities. This amendment has been given first and second reading by the SLRD board and has been referred to member municipalities for comment, and that's where we're at right now. We're providing comment at second reading. And also, Councillor Race, to your point, there have been some changes proposed at second reading at this point, so I'm wondering if perhaps some of those changes to the legislation that you had referred to have occurred, so that because there is some changes happening in this RGS as we're moving through. So I would presume there's been changes to the legislation now. The RGS amendment includes a range of changes to the goals and strategic directions in the existing RGS. These amendments address a range of policy topics: transportation, housing, economy, environment, recreation, and First Nations. It also includes new goals and strategic directions for food systems and climate change. And a lot of the policy in this document reflects the member municipality OCPs, such as ours. We provided our OCP content as we were developing it to the RGS, and they incorporated a number of elements so that the communities are all sharing an overall structure, and there's really good alignment between our OCP and the RGS. So nothing significant there to say. And we're still in the background. We'll get to the kind of final changes that are relevant to today's discussion. The review resulted in proposed changes to the RGS amendment process, and this is worth noting. There are two separate processes that exist for amendments to the RGS. One is a major amendment process and one is a minor amendment process. Major amendments must be accepted by all affected local governments by resolution of the local government. It's the same as adopting the RGS in the first place. And so if there's a major change, everyone in the regional district has to agree on that. And that's when, if everyone doesn't agree, it goes to arbitration. Alternatively, there is a minor amendment criteria that's outlined in the RGS. And in that situation, if 2/3 of the SLRD board agree that something is minor, then it doesn't need the entire major amendment process, which is a more significant process. And in addition, once something's determined to be minor, it's only required to receive a majority vote at the SLRD board.
Can I check you?
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry, apologies, yes. Just trying to be responsible.
I appreciate it. That's offended.
So at the SLRD, I heard some discussion about the different types of voting, and there's weighted and unweighted voting. When you were speaking about 2/3, is that a simple 2/3?
I think so. Okay. I think so. Yeah, it's not weighted. Weighted is typically financial, this is not.
Okay. Previously, for the minor amendment criteria, the way it was outlined was that a minor amendment would be something that was either not regionally significant or contribute to achieve a compact, complete, and sustainable community. Those are the criteria, or maybe it was both. Once it was in that category, it would be considered a minor amendment. That has been somewhat subjective at some of the board discussions and has led to some challenges, and so the SLRD staff had wanted to provide clarity around what minor would be or what criteria would be for a minor amendment. So there's new minor amendment criteria, regional non-significance, consistency with the RGS, which is very similar to what was outlined previously. There's a number of housekeeping items that have been outlined that would be considered minor, and those are text and map amendments to correct errors, statistical updates, and formatting and proofing corrections. And then also there's language to specifically identify what is regionally significant, because that had been a discussion point in past meetings. So changes that impact ALR or agricultural land is considered regionally significant. Development of non-settlement lands not contiguous to designated settlement areas, impacts to the highway system, and significant impacts to energy emission or climate change mitigation or adaptation. And also anything not identified specifically as minor is considered major. So that's the proposed changes to the amendment process. The updated ArcGIS also includes updated settlement area mapping. The maps for the District of Squamish have been updated to reflect our new OCP growth management boundary, as well as to include areas of First Nations interest outside the growth management boundary east of Valley Cliff. These changes were submitted by district staff and accepted by the SLRD. The intention was to maintain autonomy in decision-making for areas where development opportunities might potentially be anticipated up to and beyond the timeframe of the current OCP. This is a question that had come from Councillor Anderson around this, and I've got maps there on the side, and I also have a map here. This purple map shows the changes. The inner area, which is hatched, which is a bit hard to see here, but I can point to it. I'm going to get mad, but I'm going to point to it right here. These areas here are all currently in our settlement planning area, and then this, and that. Those are areas that we've added to settlement mapping to reflect the growth management boundary and some First Nations interests outside the growth management boundary. Any questions on that? Oh, sorry, yeah.
Specifically to the map, the one that we've been furnished with, the copy of the SLRD settlement planning area map, is quite small scale, and it's really just a matter of detail. I assume that lots 509, 510 are taken into account in the settlement planning area in the SLRD map. That's my interpretation. However, down in the southern area...
Hold on. That was one question.
Very good.
509, 510 is included, as are all the future residential neighborhood areas.
Right. Down on the southerly portion, adjacent to Bailey Street, we have some areas that are not included in our growth management boundary in our OCP. But it's difficult to determine on the SLRD map as to whether there's an alignment there, and that is our old landfill. These are BCR properties, lands, formerly the municipal landfill.
I believe those are included.
Yeah. Yeah, the northern portion of that land is included in the settlement planning area. In the southern, there's one block there, and the southern portion, I think because of the environmental designation, is not included.
That may perhaps be the Nature Trust owned property is not included, whereas the landfill, former district municipal landfill, is included. I'll assume that to be the case.
Thank you.
Okay. To support district autonomy, staff made a few additional requests in the process, the RGS process. One is this one that's identified in the red polygon. Staff requested the addition of language stipulating that mapping is not submitted as part of the regional context statement. Our current regional context statement does not have mapping, and we requested that that be formalized and put into the document. Because we're required to be consistent, our OCP is required to be consistent with the RCS. We felt that having mapping in the RCS was not appropriate, and so they have accommodated that, and it has been added. The first reading of the RGS bylaw also included language stipulating that for RCS revisions that trigger an RGS amendment, the amendments must be processed concurrently, and this actually gets to the point of what Councillor Wace was talking to earlier. The SLRD planning staff had indicated they felt that to tighten up the link between OCPs and RGS, that it would be appropriate that if there was an RCS change that said over time, the RGS will be changed to have that consistency, that rather than having that over that time possibility, that instead, if there's an RCS change that required an RGS change, that those have to happen concurrently, and that the RGS amendment must be adopted prior to the RCS being accepted. And so, as planning staff, we felt that that was not appropriate. It's beyond what the LGA requires, and so we requested that that not be incorporated. That was feedback that council provided to the SLRD at first reading, and that concurrency not be required. And now we're caught up to today. We have amendments that have occurred following second reading that have incorporated a bunch of input. The updated bylaw has been provided to all the member municipalities to provide feedback. Most importantly, from the District of Squamish's standpoint, that our request regarding the concurrency of RCS amendments and RGS amendments has been removed. That provision is no longer within the RGS, so I think that's appropriate. There have been a number of other changes that reflect public input. These are about exploration of access points to parks and natural spaces, support for recreational tourism opportunities, support for sustainable diverse economy, and additions to the regional road network improvement table, specifically regarding Duffy Lake Road. And in addition, as part of this amendments to the following second reading, input from Whistler has been addressed. Some future development option sites on the periphery of Whistler have been included in the settlement planning map, and I'm going to speak to that for a minute in response to a request from council prior to this meeting. So I just want to provide a little bit of detail about that. The Whistler request was to amend the RGS to include their 7 option sites as urban areas in the settlement planning map. These sites reflect land that's allocated for a mix of residential, commercial, and recreation facilities in the approved 60-year Whistler Resort Master Plan. The sites have also been incorporated into the Whistler 2018 OCP, which is currently at first reading. The request to update the settlement mapping is similar to the request by the District of Squamish based on our OCP process, where we wanted to expand the urban areas in the settlement mapping. However, these changes have only been incorporated at this late stage in the RGS because the Whistler OCP process was at a later process than ours was. We were more advanced and able to incorporate our request into the RGS early. Whistler was later, and so theirs have come later. The RGS steering committee supported these changes given that the proposed areas are within the municipal boundaries of Whistler and are adjoining or near to existing development. And Whistler is looking for autonomy over decision-making within its municipal boundaries in the same way that Squamish requested changes to maintain autonomy within our boundaries. The size of the option sites in the Whistler change is comparable or smaller to additions requested by Squamish and Pemberton through other processes or this process as well. And just to give you a visual on it, the 2 red polygon or red ellipses on this map identify the location. There's orange lines that surround 7 different polygons on those 2 maps. Those are the option sites. Here is the existing or the draft 1 settlement planning map, and then if you look here, you can see where they've added the urban area for the option sites for Whistler. Any questions about that?
Councilor Rees?
So the effect of that, if that goes through, would be that when Whistler decides to develop in those areas, do an OCP change and zoning presumably, that would not trigger an RGS referral, is that correct?
That is correct. It would be consistent with the RGS. So they would not need to go through an RGS.
So I guess that caused me a little concern because I think we all saw the email from Mr. McLeod and it referred to a decision of the board at the Regional District Board on October 28th, and I was there, and that was the second reading, and that was in it. I went back into the agenda and dug into the report, which was way in there, and found that it hadn't been identified earlier. But what has come out now that was not part of any discussion I was at the board is that potentially is about 30,000 bed units, give or take. And basically by this amendment, we're, as far as in the context of the RGS, the regional district is saying it's up to you. And so the comparison to the proposal from Garibaldi and Squamish, for example, and I'm not advocating for one or the other, is that if that was advanced, that everybody seems to agree would trigger an RGS referral with the restrictions that might be placed on it because of that. And so I'm concerned about that, not because I'm advocating for one or the other, but just to try to treat these things with an even hand. Because now we're dealing with sort of two additions to ski resorts, and there's all the constraints and concerns we've heard about development and the highway and so forth. And this potentially is even larger than Garibaldi and Squamish. And so, from a fairness perspective, it seems to me that we either say no to that, and when they are ready to go ahead, go through the RGS process like Garibaldi and Squamish might have to do, or we go and add Garibaldi and Squamish to the settlement map, so that it becomes local autonomy. Because it's a bit of a longer discussion, and I don't want to get too far into it, but this whole local autonomy thing that prompted the debate back in 2009 was around things like this. And what was raised was Quest as the example. Quest was not in the OCP. Along comes this proposal, and Squamish embraced it. Had the RGS been in place then, it would have required unanimity for that proposal to get through the RGS process. When you had competing municipalities, Whistler and Pemberton actually, is also potential sites for that university. And so there was concern around that, not that they would have done anything wrong, but just creating a structure where that kind of thing could happen. And so the thought was that everything within the boundaries would be left up to the municipalities, and everything in the regional district outside would be part of the RGS. And that was the problem at the time. All the 4 municipalities had fairly tight OCPs, smart growth on ground, densification, etc. It was the regional district that was causing the problems because they were the ones that were zoning Porteau in the middle of nowhere, and they zoned Wedgwood just north of Whistler. And they were the ones that were contributing to the highway sprawl and all the problems that the RGS is supposed to fix. And so that was the intent coming out of that electoral areas meeting. And the catch now is the regional context statement. And I can remember asking our director of planning at the time, I know not you guys, but he sort of dismissed that and said it wouldn't be a problem, we could just say in the future we'll get in line. Then you start thinking about that, well, okay, and then you go and build development and they say no, now you can't unbuild development, so how does that ever work? So it's kind of, if we're stuck with this regional context statement being the catch, which really takes away from local autonomy, then somehow it has to apply fairly and evenly with these different developments. And that's where I'm concerned about this. And I can assure you there was no discussion at the board around the plans for Vail, checking the south, 30,000 bed units, Vail master plan. That was never raised when I was at the board in the context of these amendments to the regional growth strategy. There was a discussion around destination resorts, which is a separate issue, but not around this kind of development.
I didn't see anything when I read through, but is there anything about municipal boundary expansion? Because to the degree this tries to give municipalities autonomy within their boundaries, I mean, Garibaldi and Squamish is kind of very separate from this development because that is not part of any municipal boundary right now. So is there any language right now about municipalities' ability to change municipal boundaries in the context of the regional growth strategy?
Yeah.
No, we don't believe there is.
I don't think so.
Right now, that area, the Garibaldi proposal is outside of our boundary. And the reason why our context statement was accepted with the changes in the regional growth strategy was because it went through the OCP process. And the regional, at the SLRD advisory committee table, we agreed that if a jurisdiction wants to make changes to their settlement areas, now is the time. But that has to go through a public process locally. And that's the reason why Whistler came in a bit later with their changes, just like we did, without providing much rationale for the expansion in our settlement areas as well. So if Garibaldi or Squamish came through with an application, it would probably have to be an application to the regional district, because it's, well, first of all, it's outside of our boundary now, and go through that process, just like Whistler is going through right now, and just like the district has gone through.
I wonder if the steering committee talked about the scope of these additions in line with the fact that we now define major amendments that include impacts to the highway, and significant impacts to regional energy emissions or climate change mitigation and adaptation. And something of this scope would certainly trigger an impact to the highway. So how do we, but if we did something grand in Squamish and had an impact on the highway, but it was within our municipal boundaries, can we just ignore those criteria on the RGS, the major amendment?
Yeah, so, okay, a couple of things there. So, this was actually discussed a fair bit at the steering committee table, and it was a challenging topic. Because this is a major amendment, there was a question, is this the right time to try to do this? But at the steering committee level, we felt like, at least at this point, it would be an appropriate time to at least contemplate and discuss it, because to leave it for a separate process seemed like it might be inequitable for Whistler, given that Squamish had gone through, because of our timing of our OCP, we had the opportunity to use this process to do our amendments. So there was a feeling of equity that we felt was probably reasonable to provide to Whistler. And in terms of the major amendment impacts, like impacts to climate change, in Squamish we are proposing a lot of growth over time that, because they're within our boundaries, they will have impacts to all these issues. And we're basically saying we want the autonomy to be able to make those decisions on our own. We want to be able to make those without the regional district being the group that gets to control those decisions. And so I think there was a feeling that it would be unreasonable to then say, well, another municipality shouldn't have that kind of flexibility. But it's a challenging question to tackle, because there's a fair bit of land in there that's being contemplated for growth. I will point out a couple things. I have had a conversation with the planning director about this specific topic that we're discussing about right now, just today. He got in touch. And he wanted to point out that those sites do represent 200 hectares of land, but the master plan that has been approved by the provincial government, it's a fraction of that. That's maybe 25 hectares that actually can be developed. They've just kind of created larger polygons within which they can figure out where their development goes. In our expansion of our settlement, or our urban area in the settlement planning map, we actually added 625 hectares to our land. So they're actually looking at about a third of the expansion that we've looked at. And Pemberton also has gone through a process where they had added, Whistler provided these numbers, they've done some analysis, and they said it looked like Pemberton had about 169 hectares and 725 in previous expansion. So it's, I think all of the municipalities are concerned about these issues, about, what are we doing to the highway? How does this growth impact the environment, climate change, transportation? But at the same time, we all do want to be able to make our decisions for what's best for our communities within our boundaries, and not have the oversight of the regional district creating this other layer. So I think at the steering committee, we were struggling with how to address this, and we felt like, well, we know autonomy is a big issue, and we want to try and maintain that, and so it's hard to say that we felt it wasn't appropriate for another community. But if that's a concern at our council, then we should provide that. And I can see that the comparison to Garibaldi Squamish is something that needs to be considered. The one other thing that the planning director Whistler said was that the 30,000 number was not the addition; it was the total build out that would occur. So I haven't had time to look at these numbers closely enough to understand that, but he had pointed out it's not a new 30,000 increment that gets added on. That was the total. But I didn't have time to clarify that, so I can't speak to that certainty.
Oh, I was going to question here, I think.
That just answers my question.
Okay.
Just to clarify that, the total of the Whistler bedrooms,
You know what? It was like literally just a couple minutes before I ran into the office here. I mean, to the chambers. and
Whistler
he-
bed units are somewhere north of 60,000 right now.
Yeah, so that's why it didn't make sense to me. But he was trying to say that the 30 was not the addition. Maybe the 30 was what was spread over all of their future growth. Again, I'm not 100% clear on that. So perhaps I shouldn't even brought it up. But it's like,
I think for us, it's important, the principle is important, which is local autonomy. And it goes both ways. Whistler did not question, why we're adding these lands. Our regional context statement was accepted. So we applied the same principle back in that, if there was another proposal in the district that was actively being considered, we probably would have put it into this process, but there isn't one at the moment.
Can I just ask a process question? So this is a courtesy referral. We get to provide comments, and then it goes to public hearing. Because they've given second reading, have they not?
they don't.
There's no public hearing.
There's no public hearing.
So there's no other public process?
But, okay, so the next steps. So because the LGA requires a 60-day affected local government referral, and they didn't want to launch into that right now because there were some significant changes, and so they did this courtesy referral for us to give feedback. And to be honest, at the steering committee level, a lot of the stuff that was happening is somewhat awkward for us because we haven't had a chance to check in with council on some of these matters, and so it was determined that it would be more appropriate to do this courtesy referral, get feedback before launching into the 60-day referral, and then once the 60-day referral is complete, then the SLRD board can contemplate third reading. So we're doing actually 2 referrals in a row to try and provide an opportunity for feedback before going into another referral where we can then do, where we can give our formal feedback, but there isn't a public process. This is the kind of check-in that the SLRD does. They did hold open house meetings throughout the regional district.
They did, but the report points out that these Whistler lands were not included in the public process.
And also, to be honest, those open house meetings are very poorly attended.
Poorly attended, yeah.
It is worth it to point out that Whistler did go through its own OCP process, so the consultation in Whistler on those lands did take place.
Councilor Benio?
So it sounds like from what you said, the number of hectares of expansion doesn't necessarily translate into number of new people, new sewage facilities and so on. Can you speak to that a bit, or do we have a measure of how much sort of more people and infrastructure we're talking about in these various proposals?
Unfortunately, I don't have enough knowledge of that, what would occur in these lands to speak to it in an informed manner. So, as I said, I had a quick conversation with a planning director from Whistler just 20 minutes ago before this meeting started, and he wanted to point out that it was a portion of those lands that would be developed, and that the number of units, there was something about the number of units, that 30,000 the addition, it was the ultimate addition. Maybe that's across other lands too. I apologize that I'm not able to succinctly speak to that.
But it's safe then, or I shouldn't assume that 300 hectares means 3 times the number of new people and sewers and stuff as 100 hectares of expansion. It's not a straight comparison necessarily.
I'm assuming not, but I'm very hesitant.
No, I believe the main purpose of that expansion is for commercial purposes. So it's going to be part of the new ski base area.
So, Council, we're starting to get into areas of speculation because we don't have Whistler planning staff here, and as Councilor Ray said, the board didn't discuss this at their October meeting. And I think perhaps part of our suggestion back is that the board does discuss this addition at the next meeting. Maybe Councilor Ray can speak to that a little bit. Because I don't want us to sit here and speculate what it means for Whistler or for the corridor without actually having people that can speak to it here in the room. It's hypothetical. And I think also, from my perspective, this is something that's within their municipal boundary. Garibaldi and Squamish is outside, so it's hard to draw a straight line comparison between those two developments. But I don't want us to go down a rabbit hole where we're trying to speculate on what isn't intended with these lands without the people. Maybe Councilor Ray.
Yeah, excuse me. I guess the difficulty I'm having is that they are quite similar proposals, ski resorts essentially, and to treat them, try to treat them fairly. So, when you sort of step back and look at this, all of the municipalities are going to grow over time. We're certainly growing right now, and so we're providing extra lands in our settlement area. We're getting extra lands in our settlement area to provide for future growth. Not a ski resort, but maybe just housing, commercial and so forth. And so Whistler's doing the same thing, because that's their business, that's their commercial and so forth. So the fact that there's going to be a ski lift running to it is kind of a Whistler thing, not a Squamish thing, but nevertheless, they're doing the same thing. And I guess one of the difficulties I have is what if, trying to be fair to Garibaldi and Squamish, what if this council or a future council decided it was in our best interest to expand our boundary, take Garibaldi and Squamish in, and now we want to go and somehow deal with it, and at the moment, being not in our settlement area, it would trigger an RGS referral, which is fraught with difficulty for any proponent. It could be, especially where you have a competing municipality in the same business. It's the same problem you hypothetically could have run into with Quest University, for example. So how do you deal with that fairly? And unless there was, and I just can't really think of a solution. I mean, I'm just kind of guessing. But I guess that's where I get stuck with this, is recognizing everybody has to grow. We provide for it. We're being provided for. Whistler would like to be provided for. Pemberton's being provided for. Lillooet maybe as well. But how do you deal with something like that, where you have a specific, a competition between proposals that might come along on more or less the same time frame? And I don't know the answer to that really. I'm just kind of stuck with that. And, if we could do it overnight, we'd say, okay, well, let's expand our boundary, add that to the settlement area, and then we'll deal with it in our zoning process. But we can't do that overnight. That's about a 3 or 4 year process right now. So we would catch maybe the next amendment and try to do it through an amendment, or if we did get an application by council, refer it through the RDS process. But that's kind of a one vote you're dead process, apart from arbitration. And we know there'd be one vote.
So do you have any thoughts on feedback?
Well, I think we want to give that feedback. How do we try to make it fair when there is competing? See, our housing doesn't necessarily compete with Whistler housing, or our industrial park doesn't necessarily compete with Whistler. Now you're going to have two proposals which would be more or less in competition with each other. And we're basically giving a pass to one of them right now in this process. And the other one, we're leaving kind of a very steep uphill.
Can I just challenge that a bit, because I thought these lands were identified a long time ago in their expansion plans, like how Whistler's mapped out. So like one has existed and is a ski resort since the 60s and sort of has this approval from the province to grow at such a speed and so many bed units. And the other one is a proposal that's not part of inside of a municipal boundary and is brand new, like start something from scratch. So I'm just wondering if staff can comment on like how long have these lands been sort of known?
Again,
Yeah,
I'm not super
we're
well
speculating.
informed on Whistler's ins and outs, but I know that their master plan was updated within the last decade. I don't know how long ago it was, and it's possible that this second base area was added as part of that master plan update. It's in the master plan update. That's kind of the origin
2013
point
is a date in our report.
when the master plan was updated.
Anyway, council, what comments do we want to send back to the SOIP? Councilors?
Perhaps you might advise, I have a question regarding the process since February 2016 and the timeline that was set out for the public engagement process. And my concern is that was not followed. It was delayed significantly. And I just wondered whether, and we can return to this at another occasion, but for the public and for stakeholders, it's always frustrating when the process, like in our RGS or an OCP, is long delayed. It happened to us from 2002 to 2007, and longer. And so there were stakeholders wanting to provide input, but the schedule for that engagement process was delayed by months. I wondered if you could comment, what was the reason for that? It would be something that we would wish to avoid next time. And so in February 2016, or around at that time, a plan was put together for an engagement process which was not held to. There were significant delays by up to a year.
Yeah. There were a number of issues that ended up taking quite a bit of time to sort through at the steering committee group. And I think my biggest recollection is that we ended up having to meet over and over again to try and come to consensus at the steering committee level before providing recommendations from that group that would then go to the SLRD board. And this is an example where we've had some challenges coming to or agreement on what to do about this issue, which has led to additional courtesy referral, and the whole process. Each time that group, which only meets periodically, gets together, or can only meet so often, those, as issues take longer to resolve there, the process has dragged on. And that's my biggest recollection for delays. But do you have any other?
I think there were a number of elected officials meetings that weren't planned for initially. And at the beginning of the process, there was a decision made to proceed with one set of amendments first, and then do the rest of it later. So I think that extended the timelines. But it was a lot to do with the steering committee having to meet over and over and over again to hash out the issues.
Was one of those issues the definition of a minor versus major amendment criteria? My personal involvement is that a group of stakeholders were wanting to know whether their proposed amendment to the RGS what type of an amendment was it? And the steering committee wasn't in a position to advise on this for a long period of time. And so at the very last stage of the process, the compromise was that a reference was included, a strategic direction was included. And this relates to portlands here at Squamish. So my general concern is that if we want a robust engagement process and lots of people turning up to our meetings, what we want to avoid is a long drawn-out process with not a clear timeline for engagement and the events and processes relating to public engagement.
Yeah, it's a fair comment. And just to be clear, the SLRD staff ran and had the engagement process created and approved by the SLRD board. And Squamish's involvement was to sit on the steering committee, the RGS steering committee, and participate in that group. But I agree that the process has taken longer and I think was more complicated than originally anticipated, and more challenging to come to consensus on issues around autonomy and how the RGS and RCS relate to each other, those types of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to wrap up, I would like to, are there comments that council wants to include in this referral back on the amendments that have been made or proposed, accepted or rejected? Councilor French?
I just want to take a second to talk about context. We often are
talking about competition between Squamish and Whistler in the resort world. And I think if we shift our thinking off of competition and to complementary, so we have the North Shore with its 3 ski, snowboard operations, and then when people think about winter adventure, Whistler probably overshadows those locations. But if we think of ourselves as an adventure destination that starts with the North Shore Mountains, comes up to Squamish, Whistler, and even beyond into Pemberton, Duffy Lake, we could really look at ourselves as an adventure destination region if we remove that competition thinking and thought more of it as complementary, and not just ski resort, but all season, which would include mountain bike adventures all the way from lift assisted to deep backcountry. And I think that's the context that we need to approach this whole resort discussion around.
I think, as council deliberates on the Garibaldi and Squamish, that's certainly part of it. The regional growth statement is purely policy statements. It doesn't express an opinion one way or the other. So, but I think for our own internal discussions, it's valid. Yes? Do you want to respond to that, or?
Not exactly that. I absolutely agree with you, but I was going to suggest something as council is trying to come up with ideas of what kind of feedback and why. If the next decision, I believe, will be whether the district of Squamish accepts, if this amendment proceeds, the next decision for the district will be whether it accepts the amendment or not. And one way to put it on the record that the expectation for the district is that when the district is ready to consider something like what Whistler is going through within our boundaries, put it as a motion, as a notice to the regional district that we would expect the same level of involvement as Squamish has in other jurisdictions. Something to that effect in the motion, so that the board is notified and the board can discuss that when it receives this feedback. Just an idea.
I'm not sure I understood.
So my suggestion is one thing that council could consider is passing a motion, because now we have to provide this feedback. The next decision will be either yes or no. The feedback would be that if Squamish, accepts the amendment, then it would expect the same treatment.
Okay.
If it is to consider a ski operation in Squamish.
Hereford, then Petio, then Race.
I understand the anonymity, or the autonomy to be able to make these decisions inside the each municipality's borders. I feel like this does really push up against the comfort threshold of that. Like if this was, it feels like a bit of a workaround for the process. Although admittedly it is the time to do it, and they didn't, and the other municipalities around did that. And I would like to have a clearer idea of what that actually is and the hard numbers on that to fully understand what that does to the highway traffic. If that gets built out, and we're already having crisis getting, or just don't try to get around town on a Sunday or whatever, So it doesn't sit well with me that way. I think it's running up against the upper limits of what is sort of a neighborly courtesy. Just sort of slide in an extra. There's a 30,000 number floating around. That's a lot. So I don't know. Just like defining the minor and major amendments in that process, I think this is really pushing the higher end of what you just sort of roll through. But I don't know how to articulate that in some sort of comment. That's how I'm feeling about that one.
I certainly think it warrants a conversation at the board. It concerns me that the board didn't talk about it in October, even though it was in the report. So I think part of our comment is that all board directors should understand what this addition means at the next board, before it goes to a 60-day effective government. I don't know if the rest of the council would be supportive of that, but that was my recommendation by Councilor Pettengill and then Councilor.
So my thoughts after reading this is there's a lot of really good stuff in here that I thought made a lot of sense for our region. I respect how long and difficult this process has been, so I'm somewhat hesitant to derail it. When I look at the changes that we made in terms of developable area, comparing it to Whistler, I have a hard time saying that what Whistler's asking for is out of line. It wouldn't be terrible to have some clarification about how potentially developable land translates into actual development. But in general, I am at the moment feeling fairly supportive. I mean, if I was starting day one, there's things I would change, but given everything where we are, I'm reasonably comfortable with this.
Thank you. Councilor Reese?
Excuse me. Yeah, and going just back to Councilor Fench's point about competition, I was the person that put the word out on the table. And I take your points, Councilor Fench's points, but I'm just not sure that they're shared outside of this room by other bodies. And so I think that's where that came from. I kind of like staff's approach because I tend to agree with Councilor Pettengill. We're expanding our settlement area. That would result in presumably thousands of bed units being added if it was built out over time. It's fair to us to say to another municipality, but you can't expand yours. And so I don't want to give up the ones that we're getting because that restricts our local autonomy even more. So I'm inclined to say, okay, yeah, we'll do it. And if Whistler's going to do that, then do what they propose to do. I would like, and it is tricky, and I still do have difficulty with it. I like Mr. Belishka's idea that, yeah, we get them to agree that if we want to expand for a destination resort of some kind, they will consider that the same way. We can get that kind of commitment. I'm not sure how they can give it to us. It's like pre-zoning almost, so it's just...
It's symbolic.
Yeah, and whether it's binding or not on a future board, I'm not sure if there's a way around it.
Can I clarify a point though? I thought Jonas was saying that they wouldn't question anything that was within our municipal boundaries. Which, this is within their municipal boundaries.
Well, I get
We're
that.
not talking about expansion because it already says in the RDS that if something's expanding, then it's a major amendment. It says that. So just a point of clarifying, you were saying that if it's within our municipal boundaries, we would expect Whistler to say, yep, great. But if we're contemplating expanding to take in something new, that's a different,
That would be a separate process.
that's a totally separate process.
We'd have to do the expansion first, and
That's the difference in my mind. They're doing something within their municipal boundary. If everyone started to go, oh, I can expand and do something new without triggering RDS, that's not. I think what we're trying to do is capture what do we have autonomy over within our existing boundaries, and how big can that change be? Is that so? Were you talking about within boundaries or?
within boundaries with the assumption that that boundary would be expanded for a ski operation to happen in Squamish, obviously.
I think that goes against all the other criteria for a major amendment, and I think that's too much to ask.
Well, I'm not saying that it wouldn't require a major amendment, it would, but what I'm saying is that, we would expect the same process as we went through. Let's say there was another RGS amendment going through in 5 years, and the district of Squamish had expanded its boundaries and was requesting a change.
Councilor Stoner?
Maybe this is totally out of line, but is it worth considering proposing if there was a proposal that came forward that was significantly large enough that was perhaps in line with the regional context statement, but it impacted 3 of the 4 bullet points that would otherwise trigger a major amendment, that it would have to be referred to the regional, to the SLRD. So thinking back to what Mayor Elliott had said, where it's like a growth of that scale would impact the highway, would impact climate change and emissions, and perhaps one of the other 4 components that would be a requirement for a minor or for a major amendment to the RGS.
Well, any one of those can trigger a major amendment.
Right. But if it's within a municipal boundary and or within a regional context statement, then maybe there's a different threshold there. I'm not sure. Something to think about. If that's.
I think under the current, it's okay. I think under the current, the way it's the criteria is structured, I know it's not super clear, but I think if you had a municipal boundary and an urban area and then non-settlement area outside the urban area, if something was proposed there that was impacting the regional transit system, significant impacts to energy, I think that could still trigger a major amendment.
But what if it's inside the settlement area?
Oh, inside. Oh, you're saying in the urban area?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I understand.
Which obviously then you would have to define like a threshold of how large is that project,
Right.
how significant, like. But I'm just trying to find a workaround where it's. I think that my comments back are that I would really like the SLRD board to discuss this again to some degree. It's important that this be brought up in conversation. And just balancing that requirement for municipal autonomy and the equitable and fair process for these major projects, and the reality that I think the highway traffic and the climate change and emissions pieces are the critical components to growth in the region. And the rest of the RGS speaks to how do we address that. And if this goes to both Squamish and Whistler and Pemberton, if we continue to allow that level of growth without that regional overview, then we're not going to get to where we want to be with the RGS.
And sorry, I forgot one thing I wanted to add, and Councillor Stoner just touched on it. I'm a little bit skeptical we'll meet some of our objectives without giving up some autonomy and having some of that, I guess, collaboration and give and take at the regional level. And so that does mean, part of me would like to say, well, maybe we need to think about the growth, because there is a lot of growth planned for Squamish and Whistler and Pemberton, and maybe we need to take another look back and scale all of that back a little bit in a fair way. But again, I'm trying to balance that feeling between, how long this process has been and the benefits that are there.
Yeah, thank you. I think generally, I haven't canceled talk about any other issues with the amendments or what's in the document that's before us. I think there are concerns that I've heard about the fact that this is a late addition, that it didn't go through the public meetings, and that the board didn't discuss the size and scope of the Whistler vision. So I think our feedback is that there's no major issues with the document as it stands. And shoot your hand up, council, if I'm getting this off base here. But that we do feel the board needs to have a conversation again about size and scale of what happens within our municipal boundaries and how it affects the goals we've set for the region. And the board may not come to consensus on that, but at least it's a conversation that should be had, I think, given that it didn't receive, and it's a matter of fairness. So, and the only other thing that is that in the climate change section, on page 86, I always try to future-proof these documents. I think we tried to do this with our OCP, but it specifically refers to the Climate Leadership Plan of 2016. And I think it shouldn't refer to specific provincial plans, because now there's the Clean BC plan. And then under the next government, there'll be the next one and the next one. So I think adopt provincial GHG reduction targets is the right language, referring to specific plans there, just to, because I actually think the targets will have to accelerate over time. The government's still missing 25% of its reduction targets. So we should just leave it a bit more vague if the SRD supports with that. So that would be my comments back, Councillor Rice.
Thank you. And I think sort of tossing these different things around, I think there is merit in what Jonas suggests, getting some statement of intent, or yes, we might do that. It might not be binding, but keep in mind that if Squamish saw fit to expand its boundaries and saw the benefit to a proposal like this, and took it to the regional, and zoned it, and took it to the regional district, I'm trying to preserve as much of Squamish's autonomy as possible. If the regional district voted it down, that would trigger the arbitration process. And statements like that can affect an arbitration. Not necessarily decide it, but certainly kind of create the context and maybe ultimately sway the arbitrator one way or the other. So I think there would be some value to it, even though it's not contractual, it's not locked in. If we can get that kind of agreement out of it to consider destination resorts or consider something like this, if Squamish wanted to go ahead with it. I'm not sure how exactly you phrase that, but I think there would be some value to that. I'm concerned about the fairness aspect, and I'm concerned about Squamish's autonomy, and I'm trying to reconcile these things, and have to recognize that Whistler's position, I mean, when they expand something, it's for skiing. When we expand something, it's for a whole bunch of other things. It's not necessarily for skiing. So we're going to expand. We're providing for ourselves in this thing. So I think we have to be fair to other municipalities as well, but we still want to make sure that this particular proposal gets a fair shake at the end of the day. If this council thinks it's a good idea to go with it, I would rather not have it frustrated somewhere else.
Councillor French?
So I'd like to take what Councillor Race has said and maybe just sum it up in one sentence, in that when I finished reading all of this material, I was left with the overall feeling that Squamish's potential for economic development is seriously capped by this document. And I don't think that's fair for Squamish. And so in the world of fairness and economic development potential, I think Squamish is being held back by this document.
For this particular pursuit.
I just consulted the map schedule on the wall, the furthest, I think that's Schedule C, growth management, and the former municipal landfill is not included there. So just if we could have that confirmed, because that is an example of a property it's under long-term discussion, I suppose, but I would not wish to see that be addressed or need to go through an RGS referral. That doesn't make sense to me. So I just wanted to confirm that map alignment.
So if I may, the Schedule C is our official community plan.
Yes.
And the rest of those two schedules are in the regional growth strategy.
Yes.
So the intent was to make the settlement area in the regional growth strategy larger than our growth management boundary, so that we, those sites that could have some potential down the road were included, and we wouldn't have to go for the RGS amendment.
Very good, then.
All right.
Alleviated.
So locally, it would be an OCP amendment,
Exactly.
Yes.
but
Within our
not
autonomy.
trigger a RGS amendment. Does that help?
If the map is still a bit fuzzy.
Yeah.
But that's just the printing, so I take your the clarification.
Okay, so I think the feedback is the board should discuss, at least, that there is potentially a statement to be added about fairness of process. That in future, the community engagement piece should be laid out more clearly and more robustly. That they look at the document again and not refer to any provincial plans specifically, but try and future-proof the document. And the same thing. I think that's it.
Does council want to make a motion including those comments that endorses the amendment?
Sure. Council? Anybody? Council Rice? Moved by Council Rice, seconded by Council Huffman. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a quick half hour, wasn't it?
Sorry.
That's okay. I think we were all surprised by that addition, so we had to have a discussion about it. Thank you.
It does appear significant, but it's the principle of
Yeah.
equal treatment and autonomy.
Okay, so next up, we have council update on large projects and initiatives. There's an order here. First up is water meter. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm having some technical difficulties here, so bear with me. I'm not sure what I did here. And I can't seem to undo what I did. Crikey, boy, I'm trying.
All right, well, let's take the pressure off, Mr. Merrill. Let's have a 5-minute recess.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Committee of the Whole. We've solved our technical difficulties. Dave Morrow is here to talk about one of our projects that council is getting an update on. And so the whole context for this agenda item is to just bring new councillors up to speed on some of the projects that have been ongoing. So you know where they're at. Because they may not be agenda items over the next little while, but you should still be aware that they're in the background. So this is maybe not a complete list, but it's the start of the list. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Dave Merrill, Director of Major Projects at the District. As Mary Elliott mentioned, I'm here to provide a brief update on the water meter implementation program. So just some background on this project. In 2015, the district developed a water master plan, which essentially provided a comprehensive assessment of the district's water system, both current infrastructure and needs, and also looking into the future. One of the key recommendations from that plan was to implement a water metering program in the district to prepare for future growth and to address water consumption and supply concerns. So the report assessed 4 different options for water metering. The first was the status quo, do nothing essentially. The second was implementing water meters at existing industrial, commercial, and institutional properties, or ICI properties. Third option was ICI and also all multifamily properties. And then the fourth option was universal metering, or ICI, multifamily, and single-family properties. So essentially, all properties within the district would be metered. The report recommended option number 2, which is ICI only. Council had a robust discussion at the time, and I think primarily to move as close as possible to universal metering without the huge expenditure that universal metering comes with, which I'll talk about later. Council elected to go with option 3, which was ICI and multifamily properties. So that's the direction that we've been working with this program. The Water Master Plan did identify that the district should consider universal metering at some point in the future when perhaps the finances made more sense or water supply concerns sort of became forefront. So, moving forward, we're now working on the implementation of the water metering program. And essentially, a very broad scope for this project is to install water meters at all existing non-metered ICI and multifamily properties. So currently in the district, single-family properties are not required to install water meters. They are, however, and have been for quite some time, required to install boxes outside buried chambers for future water meter installations. So sort of planning for this future universal metering, but not actually installing meters. And currently ICI and multifamily properties, any new development needs to put in a meter. So the water meter program is essentially targeting all those properties that were built before the current regulation that don't have meters. So staff applied for and received funding under the Clean Water and Wastewater Fund, CWWF fund. We received 1.6 million approximately, which was allocated to both the water metering program, but also water distribution system upgrades, so replacing aging pipe in the ground. So using the portion of funds that was dedicated to the water meters, we kicked off the project in 2017. We retained ISO engineers to be the engineering consultant for the project. And very quickly and very briefly, essentially their work in consultation with district engineering and public works staff was to develop detailed designs for sort of our typical water meter installations, both in, say, a mechanical room and also in chambers outside, which could range from, small chambers, a foot by 2 feet to 3 meters by 1.5 meters chambers for larger service sizes. So they developed the detailed design. We started looking at what sites, what properties have meters, which ones need meters. We looked at sort of for this phase of work, first phase of work for the implementation program, we decided to target sort of the larger service sizes, which granted have a larger cost associated with them because you have a larger meter and oftentimes a chamber. So that was sort of one of the goals of the first phase, was to target the larger service sizes. And also we looked at sort of areas of town. We did focused on downtown Cleveland Avenue. We did Tantalus Way up by Garibaldi Way. And we did a handful in the industrial park as well. So we identified sites. We did site-specific designs and layouts for each of those sites. And then based on that detailed design, developed tender documents and actually tendered 2 separate components. We did internal, so water meter installations within mechanical rooms. We did that as a separate contract because that's typically a plumber that would do that. And then split out the external water meters, which has excavation and chamber installation and supply as a separate contract. And then ISL assisted with the tendering, administration, construction administration, construction oversight, and internal installation oversight as well. Here's a brief summary of the work that's been completed to date, so sort of the initial phase. This work was completed primarily in 2018. At the top, we have on the left type of meter, so whether it's internal, external, and we identified 5 existing meters that had been installed but weren't able to be read by the district's software, so we couldn't actually collect data from them. So we did a quick fix there and installed new radio heads to be able to collect that data. Moving to the right has the number of meters installed, the number of residential units or businesses served by those installations. So for example, for a multifamily, there'd be 1 meter which services a number of different units. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later as well. The approximate value, and as you can see there, the externals made up the bulk of the money there, and that's again primarily, or a number of larger meters, 6-inch service size, and the associated large concrete chambers, which are quite costly. And on the first column is the approximate cost per meter, and then in brackets, the actual cost per unit. So for example, residential unit in a multi-family development. So I guess one of the key points there is with the external, it's a significant cost. However, when you're looking at installing 1 meter for a multifamily unit, the actual cost per unit typically, and that's shown by here, is less than if you were to meter every individual unit. So the district has created and maintained a frequently asked questions page on the website. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen that. I'm familiar with it. Throughout the program, we've received a lot of questions and input from the public. So I just wanted to touch on two questions and comments that came up fairly frequently. These were also highlighted in the briefing notes that you've seen. The first involves universal metering and specifically why are single-family homes not included. In addition to the background that I mentioned earlier, sort of some of the specifics that are highlighted in the water master plan are single-family homes within the district of Squamish account for approximately 90% of the total number of water services, so the majority of water service connections. However, it only represents approximately 60% of the total water consumption. The universal metering, so metering all properties, the cost for that was approximately $9.5 million in 2015 dollars, which equated to roughly a little over 4,100 meters. So significant cost that, based on a cost-benefit analysis, just didn't make sense at the time. Those large costs, as you see here, the report estimated that we need approximately a 20% increase in utility rates over 5 years to pay for that and make it feasible, which probably wouldn't be palatable. As I said, the Water Master Plan did recommend universal metering as a longer-term goal, so that's something that we can definitely look at moving forward, at council's discretion. And as I also said, new single-family homes are required to install meter boxes, which will help facilitate moving to universal metering in the future. So the second question that came up a lot, and
Yep, hold on.
sorry,
Could you go back?
absolutely.
So the expected return, 2 to 3 million, where does that come from?
So that is primarily deferred capital expenditures.
Postponing expansion.
Exactly. Yep. The second question that we heard a lot of, and a lot of passionate residents very passionate about this one, understandably so. Multifamily metering. So why do multifamily properties, townhouse complexes, for example, have 1 meter instead of meters for each individual unit? So there's a lot of text on the screen, but I just wanted to walk through each one of these to sort of provide the district's rationale for going with the 1 meter approach versus metering each individual unit. So the water system, basically, for multifamily property, the district owns the street to property line. From property line inward, it's the strata owned and maintained. So the district has no control over that portion of the pipe. We can't inspect, we don't maintain them. We have no idea the quality and the condition of those pipes. There may be common water use, for example, irrigation systems, common laundry systems that would also need water meters if we were to meter each individual unit to basically account for all of the water being used by strata. Oftentimes or occasionally you see unauthorized water use, such as somebody tapping off to run an irrigation line downstream of the meter. Or in addition, if we had meters on each individual unit, we wouldn't be able to capture leakage that would occur from between the building and the property line, which in some cases can be quite significant. Installation of meters within premises, within people's units, for example. Oftentimes you need to remove walls, ceilings, which adds expense. Water usage between strata units is generally more uniform than between single-family homes. The cost of installing 1 meter at the property, as I mentioned earlier, and as was represented by that table earlier, is often less expensive than installing individual units meters. And in addition, and from the district's sort of practical perspective, just the logistics of having public works staff go into people's units to maintain, inspect, replace if required these meters is quite onerous compared to having an external meter at the property line.
But on new construction, I can see the issues putting metering individually for maybe a 6-story apartment building, but if you had a line of townhouses and compare it to a line of single-family homes, I mean, the only thing that's different is they share common walls. You could run the water line down the front and have meters in front of each one of them if the developer wanted to do that. would be a developer's cost with new construction, of course. Is there anything in our system that would prevent them doing that?
No.
If they chose to do that, we could accommodate them.
Correct.
Councilor Craig?
So I'm sensing that there's a perception of some folks who are living in multifamily where the water meters are in place, that they're currently paying significantly more for water than those that are under the flat rate scenario. Is that the case?
Again, it's based on usage. So sort of the broader goal, and what I'll talk about on the next slide and next steps, is moving towards billing for water usage. And can I just address that?
Yes.
To the next slide, and I think we're going to move forward if you want to have more comments. Wrong way. So next steps, we plan on continuing the metering program with additional installations this year and likely next year as well. We will be issuing a new RFP for consulting services to sort of move the project forward from here, and an additional tenders, tender documents for the additional installations as well. All these meters that we're installing and existing meters in the system, we are collecting data from, and we're moving forward to analyzing the data and sort of looking at water usage. And as we get more of these online, we're going to get a better picture of how much water is actually being used in different types of businesses and residences. So as we move forward, when we have all, or at least most, of these ICI multifamily properties metered, we're going to move forward to another recommendation, or another sort of technical memorandum that was included in the Water Master Plan, which is dealt with the rate analysis. How do we actually start moving towards billing for water usage? So sort of broadly, how that's going to unfold is we're going to look at a number of different rate structure alternatives, which will be based on sort of best practices, other municipalities in the Lower Mainland. How is this done? And how would this work best within Squamish's context? We'll have a robust public consultation component to this. We'll communicate the potential changes to utility bills through consultation as well as shadow billing. So we'd issue a hypothetical bill based on these rates that we're proposing, based on their metered usage, so the resident can compare, or the business can compare what they would be paying based on their metered usage versus what they are paying versus the flat rate. We'd also have to look at any potential impacts to revenue stability. So, if we change these rates to usage-based, are we all of a sudden going to be at a shortfall in funds to fund our system for expansion and maintenance? Or are we going to be collecting too much money and be in a surplus? We want to try to find that sweet spot and make sure that moving towards meter rates is not going to handicap us for our funds. So then once all this is done, we'll put the rates in place and continue to monitor them. One of the recommendations in the report was currently in the summer we have water restrictions. Well, we could actually use the seasonal rates to try to make people more aware of their water usage in the summer, charge more in the summer, for example, to try to conserve water during those times. So with respect to your question, can you repeat it again? My apologies.
Yeah. So there's a perception out there for some people living in multifamily complexes that have water meters that they are right now paying more under a metered system than compared to their previous flat rate bill.
So if I could just clarify, there are a handful of multifamily properties that had meters installed a while ago and were put onto a billing structure that they were billed for water usage. So you're saying the question is that those residents of those buildings feel that they're paying more than they would under a flat rate. That could be the case. I don't have the information to.
Were you talking residential or commercial?
multifamily.
multifamily residential.
So, through the chair, right now, we only had about 3 properties actually being built metered. And when we crunched the numbers for them, they were paying well below a unit, as you had heard from us back in December. So I'm not clear where they're getting that information. In fact, we are sending them all letters right now telling them that we're in the process of raising those rates to make them more comparable to a single family unit.
Councillor Stone?
So in terms of the next steps for this project, we're just under $1 million in for putting in 55 of the 160. So we're looking at about, in rough ballpark, of just under 2 million for the next 105.
Through the mayor, as alluded to earlier, sort of the approach that we took for this first phase that's now complete was to try to target some of the larger water services. So the bulk of this initial $1 million was for a relatively small number of large diameter services. So moving forward, we will be able to get a lot greater number of services metered at a lower per unit cost. That concludes my...
Any other questions? Councillor Rice?
But on that point, I think, I'm just a little vague about the exact numbers, but when I read the report, I came away thinking that we're not keeping up with the budget. We're spending more than the budget, notwithstanding the fact that it's front-end loaded for some big units. It seemed to me that the costs generally were a little higher than originally predicted. And so my question is, I guess, do we have funding in place to complete this, the whole first phase, ICI and multifamily?
Through the mayor, yes. So originally when the grant application was submitted, which was in 2016, I believe, there was sort of a rough estimate done as to the number of meters that could be installed as part of the first phase, which was 160, as you mentioned. That was based on a relatively low per meter cost. There wasn't, chambers, for example, weren't considered, or if they were small chambers. So that number was based on estimates that, as we've now moved into tendering, were quite low. So the initial part of the work was funded through a small portion, I think roughly $350,000 of that grant fund, in addition to capital funds from the district. This next phase, we don't have grant funding for, so it will be through capital funding that we will expand this program and continue.
So that's coming to the budget this year?
Correct.
So a few questions. One, I saw in the fees and charges report, there's a fee for hard to reach or hard to access water meters to monitor them. Is that sort of the old meters and everything new is remotely monitorable?
We should, when this program is all done, have everything, all meters be able to be monitored remotely. There could be some legacy ones that, there may be some legacy ones, and this might be what that refers to, that we would have to go in and manually monitor. As we've shown there are some of these old ones that we can change the radio head on and then remotely monitor. So that could be where that comes from. I'm not sure if you can provide some.
Sorry, I can't provide any additional information.
Might just be a legacy charge, and eventually we'll move it out of our meter charges.
Or it could be a precautionary.
Precautionary, yeah.
Charge being old.
So, do we have, I understand we're quite restricted on how we can, or what we can levy water fees for, but do we have the capacity to, charge flat rate users an amount to build up a fund to subsidize those that might wish to install a single family amount of homes? Say I want to be proactive and install my own meter. I guess technologically, can the district support that yet? And legislatively, do we have the authority to build up a fund from flat rate users to subsidize or to incentivize, I should say, those people who want to jump on metering early?
I can't answer the question about whether we have the authority to, perhaps Mr. Buxton could. With respect to the question about whether we have the technical capabilities to sort of expand and implement building based on this, everything, the low number of meters that we actually build based on usage, it's all done manually now. We're moving towards a new financial system, as you're aware. And once that system is in place, then we will have the means to be able to sort of expand the system and be able to do building efficiently. Actually, Mr. Buxton and I met with a concerned resident about some of these questions, and one of his suggestions was sort of expanding the single-family home metering program, perhaps doing a few just to get a baseline data set. But there's also, and it's mentioned in the report, that we could have a sort of voluntary program. So somebody could go ahead and put a meter in. That currently would be at the owner's expense, but if we have the means to do something like that and the council has the will, something like providing or collecting a fund to fund those kind of meter installations, then that could be a potential option as well.
So, do you want you to ask your questions, but we have 4 more projects to get to by 3 o'clock. So, snappy, Councilor Treasurer.
Why don't we require new single-family homes to put in water meters? Why are we just requiring them to put in water boxes?
Through the mayor. That's a good question. As I mentioned or alluded to earlier, the requirement for metered boxes has been in our subdivision and development control bylaw for 15, perhaps longer years. There was actually a brief time in 2003 where the bylaw did require meters. I understand there were a handful of homes that may have had meters installed. That was quickly done away with just because we didn't have the capability at the time to monitor and bill. That could be something that we could, or council could look to in the future. Definitely, that's just sort of been the way it's been, and yeah, we haven't made any changes to that.
We've never had the back office to handle it.
Great.
So,
Thanks for that.
and maybe one day we will, but it's not this year, and it's probably not next year.
Through the mayor, if I may, I think we're all interested in looking at future metering through these programming. But one of the things that we're going to learn through this process is that the pricing models for this are tricky, and that you need enough, we really need to move into new builds of single families to get the data set to properly price it. So to have little one-offs right now coming on to the system would be an interesting pricing exercise first. So I think we're trying to get through this initial program. We're using that as the basis for how we set and monitor meter rates, how much usage comes down, because that affects, we still have to collect a certain amount of revenue for the system, regardless of how we choose to bill it. So there's a lot of factors. So just having a one-off earlier than we go through this comprehensive program would be tricky, just like you saw us grappling with the few metered properties that did end up going ahead. We really need a broader set to do the pricing models properly.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
So we get to talk about that again in budget. But we just got the background now. And then it's up to council's discretion about how fast, how slow. That's how much money we put there. Thank you. All right, next up, in a 15-minute, really engaging presentation.
Always. Are you going to start off with the development? We're talking Cheekye first, right?
No, Diking first.
I've got, Diking is next on my list. I'm not particularly picky about which order we do this in. You want to do Cheekye then?
My PowerPoint is set up so that
Yes, I'm.
Hey, we're doing Cheekye first.
Did it do it again?
No.
Yeah.
You'll need to mime your presentation.
What happened?
We had this happen again, and the only thing to fix it was rebooting. Sorry.
Is there a context statement that you can make, Gary,
Yeah,
before we hit the
do you want
slides?
to just talk about it?
Not off the top of my
Not really.
I don't have that much background on the Cheekye to be able to wing it. Well,
The reboot is actually pretty fast in this computer.
seems that it's related to this laptop. The screen's just failing on us. So.
Well, it's such a count. I would imagine that we do somewhere. There we go.
We'll be up in about another 30 seconds.
Lucky the screen came on. I was just going to ask people about their New Year's resolution.
Saved by the bell.
Okay, the Cheekye Development in 15 minutes.
I'll do the background to the development itself very quickly. So the location and context for the Cheekye proposal is north of Depot, bounded sort of, or Ross Road is right through the middle, bounded on the east by the BC Hydro power lines, and again just south of the cemetery, and north and east of the Don Ross and Brackendale Elementary. Okay, we'll skip to the current conditions. We're seeing the centre of the green area, the proposed Brackendale Park, the schools and the existing residential development on Ross Road and Depot Road. The yellow area sort of in the centre of the drawing is actually a mobile home park from, I believe, the 1980s or 1990s that got part way through. If you wander through the area, there's asphalt down. So they've gone as far as putting asphalt down, and there was a partial subdivision registered before they realised it was a debris flow hazard. So the site's partly disturbed, partly developed, partly undisturbed. It has a long history dating back to the application, the rezoning and the OCP. Amendment applications date back to 2013. It's complex, there are a number of issues. It took until 2015 to introduce that to committee of the whole. The OCP started its first reading early in March. Over the next 2 years saw a number of public information meetings held by the applicant. It was only in 2016 that we moved to second reading on the OCP and to first reading on the zoning bylaw, running them sort of slightly in parallel. At the same time, we were doing some review on alternative mitigation assessments. David's going to cover the debris flow hazard following this, but there is a debris flow hazard on the site, common to anything on the Cheekye debris flow. We were looking at what alternatives there were to the proposal that the applicant has put forward. The outcome of this alternate assessment was that one's probably the best to start with, given a number of things, but there are some others if we can't reach that conclusion. Following through the latter part of 2016, the community managed contributions and the mitigation approach, how that was going to be funded, was undertaken. We had a presentation from the Inspector of Dikes, and then second reading and scheduling the public hearing later on in November 2016. Let's quickly skip through. 2017, we actually got to the public hearing in January at the high school. It was a long public hearing. It wasn't until March 6th of last year that we brought forward new information from EMBC around funding and the new CACs. There were some discussions about barrier maintenance, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. We then had to go back and do new OCP hearings because we adopted our new OCP, so now we're amending a different bylaw. Second public hearing and third reading in July, leading us to today. The subject lands in terms of the rezoning, 48 hectares of residential, strata parks and trails about 5 acres, a small portion for the Ray Peters Trail, and then a substantial area for the Brackendale Farmers Institute Park, that large park in the middle. Current rezoning, or prior to, is a mixture of RS1 and resource. What we've amended it to, third reading, not yet adopted, is a CD 82, a new comprehensive development zone for the residential and mixed-use commercial areas. Cemetery was rezoned, and the park area will be rezoned to P3 upon adoption when we get to that point. Proposed land uses, it's big, it's 1,200 dwelling units, 537 single dwelling units on small and medium lots, and 678 apartments and townhouses. The apartments and townhouses are typically along the Ross Road, and singles, the yellow areas, mostly on the eastern portion of the site east of Ross Road. The development concept, I'll click to the next. That's the sort of the typical layout, with the strata roads predominantly in the yellow areas. That's the single family. Small parks dotted throughout. We'll skip to the next one. If you drop everything else out, those are the green spaces, parks, linear trails that are available. Ray Peters Trail sort of outlines the entire area along the southern part of the site and then along Ross Road, back to Government Road. Large central area in the darker green area is the Brackendale Farmers Institute Park. There's already a number of existing trails in that area. Sustainability initiatives range from a transit hub, a number of active transportation options, and then a number of parks and trails contained in the project. The amenity community amenity contributions range from the Farmers Park, the Peters Trail, general cash contribution, park improvements, affordable housing, 85 units through a housing agreement. These are all come at various points throughout the phasing of the development. Daycare space, and the transit node, with car sharing, electrical charging stations. So that package was dealt with council. And finally, one of the issues that we've we have sort of broached with council, but we don't have the solution to this, is the OMR, operations and maintenance reserve estimate. Maintaining the debris structure, the structure that retains the debris, is going to cost a certain amount of money. Those numbers are where we got to with the estimates that we could develop with the information that we have. There is going to be annual operations and maintenance and care of that structure. The thought was that through a local service area or some other means that we can assemble sort of an annuity or a growing fund over time that would allow us to maintain the structure on an ongoing basis, and at some point we would have enough money to deal with a major event that drops perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of debris behind that structure, and that needs to go somewhere. So we need to have some funds for dealing with that. So that issue again is on the to-do list, but it is part of the work we've done today. That's the development itself, and Mr. Ralston can give you the...
Councillor Rees, have a question?
Yeah, just on the the budget again, if you can go back, oh, maybe that's difficult now.
No, that's okay.
My only point is, I think we had the discussion around the gross costs, and I take it we're still developing those gross costs of maintenance and so forth. But there was also a discussion around apportioning them between the development itself and the whole district tax base. Because, yeah, that one. The 574, I guess, could change. We're still working on the numbers, but there was a thought that I think was 50-50, if I recall the discussion. I don't know if that's been fixed in staff mind or not.
No, I don't think we've affixed the ratio, but there was certainly, we heard council's intent that those costs will be shared between the general taxpayer and the development, because the benefit of the degree structure goes beyond the development area itself. The area subject to debris hazard that would be protected by that structure is, well, it's the entirety of the fan from Fergie's down to Decker Road to my place.
Okay, I've got a follow-up here, and then I'll go to you.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because this started, as you showed, 7, 8, 9 years ago, and initially all the conversations from the developer were the development will pay for everything. And council, I think, went out in various discussions with the community saying it's entirely development funded. What changed in the middle of that was the risk area, because when this first came to council, my first term, we were told by planning that all we need is something like a berm around Brackendale School to continue around the development, and that should be fine. And the thing that changed was the Mount Eager slide, which dropped a whole bunch more debris than anybody thought was possible, and we caused a revision in all the geotech reporting, which basically increased the risk area. So now it was apparent that this was not just for the development, but it would also benefit quite a larger, almost significant part of Brackendale. So that was the rationale for now saying, well, maybe the rest of the district should also share in the cost of this.
Mr. Ralston's going to cover that hazard far more capably than I will.
So, can I say that this cost is one of the conditions that's coming back to us. One of the conditions of adoption is to work out through council's approval what the OMR cost would be like.
Yes, there were a lot of conditions attached to the third reading, principally around the capital cost of the structure needs to be dealt with. The development to this point has indicated that can be funded through the development. And then the operations and maintenance, ongoing costs, and sort of assessing or amassing that war chest to deal with the big event is an issue that we will need to deal with. Those numbers reflect the thinking of the time, but what we need is the structure designed to know what those O&M costs will be.
Just a process question. My understanding at this point is that this has gone to a public hearing, so if someone in the public sees this and wants to talk to us about it, we need to direct them to staff at this point, or can we engage people on this topic?
Technically, you direct them to staff, because we haven't adopted. It's possible we'll go back to public hearing because of the information we'll get once the design is finished, and so we may feel that we need to go back to public hearing so the public has a chance to comment on final design and what it means for our costs and protecting the community. So technically, we should revert back to that. All right, turn back to Mr. Rowe.
Afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm David Rolson, Manager of Municipal Infrastructure for the district. So today I'm going to talk about Cheekye Fan hazard and mitigation, as well as some dike planning, and I'll sort of stop halfway after we talk about Cheekye and have an opportunity for any questions or discussion. So the Cheekye Fan is one of the largest and most well-studied alluvial fans in North America. It's a LiDAR photo that really illustrates on the geological scale what the fan is. This area is subject to debris flows, and that includes existing development, residential, there's BC Hydro substation, significant infrastructure including rail lines and the highway and schools.
So debris flow is a moving mass of loose mud, sand, soil, rock, water, and air that travels down a slope under the influence of gravity and is deposited in the valley bottom, as shown. And on the bottom right picture there is a screenshot of some debris flow modeling that's been undertaken to date. Everything is still in draft form at this stage. There's a significant history of hazard recognition, as Gary mentioned. In the 1970s, this hazard was first identified. There's been a lot of work. As I say, it's one of the most well-studied alluvial fens in Canada and certainly North America as well. So work on defining the hazard, how large it can be, and what return periods are associated, doing hazard mapping, and determining consequences, and then calculating risk, both economic and risk to loss of life. So there's been work that's been done at various stages between the 1970s and now. Our current OCP policy is to prohibit development in zones C1 and 2, which are the two darkest colored zones on this map. To process applications for up to 3 lots of small-scale development within zones C3 and C4, subject to a risk assessment that indicates the safety and any required mitigation measures. Not to process applications for anything more than 3 lots or units within zones C3 and C4 until there's new hazard mapping in place and the district has developed a policy for how to manage future development. And to require risk assessments by a qualified professional to support any land development applications that are allowable under our policy. And the OCP also has 2 sections, one on Cheekye mitigation objectives, so things from a macro scale, what the district hopes to achieve with our mitigation, and also future land use objectives for area-wide mitigation, so how to proceed with any further development once mitigation is in place. So there's been a lot of work that's taken place since the development application was initially submitted. There was a first expert panel that was assembled in 2014, and their mandate was to determine what the maximum event is that should be considered for hazard and risk assessment, and they indicated that a 1 in 10,000 year return period event could be up to 5.5 million cubic meters, and that's shown on the top right of this graph here. They also extended their mandate and recommended that all forms of mitigation should be considered and evaluated to protect both existing development and potentially new future development on the Cheekye Fen. After that, a second expert panel was formed, and their mandate was to recommend risk tolerance criteria to the district. They recommended that the risk to loss of life for an individual should be less than 1 in 10,000 per annum for existing development and less than 1 in 100,000 for new development. And then they also gave recommendations with respect to societal or group risk, that risk should fall within, on this table here, it's called an FN curve, that basically on the y-axis is the frequency of fatalities, and on the x-axis is the number of fatalities. So it's basically a representation of the likelihood of death for individuals. So that risk would need to fall within the ALARP, which stands for as low as reasonably practicable, or the broadly acceptable zones in order to support new development. And for the district to also consider, when we're developing a mitigation strategy, that we should be trying to get existing development within those zones as well. And they also reiterated that all forms of mitigation should be considered for existing development. Following that, the district commissioned Curlew-Liddell consulting engineers to complete an assessment of mitigation alternatives, and that was to basically ground truth that this upper canyon debris barrier is the preferred mitigation concept. So they reviewed 9 different options. This is intended to be a very comprehensive review that looks at all feasible mitigation options. So they looked at everything from retreat
to barriers at different locations throughout the Cheekye Fan, to berms, to building large channels across the Cheekye Fan to channel debris away from developed areas. And ultimately, it was recommended that the district pursue the Upper Canyon Debris Barrier, which is what's being pursued right now. This is just south of Cat Lake, you can see on the screen there. And it's basically, that was recommended as the preferred option because it protects the greatest area. It's at the apex of the fan, and so the entire Cheekye Fan would be, the hazard would be mitigated for the entire fan, as opposed to building a berm halfway down the fan and everything north of that would remain unprotected. And also because there's an opportunity for the district to have third-party funding through this development to construct that mitigation. This is going to be very costly, and so having that is a significant benefit to the district. Basically, the recommendation is to work with the developer to confirm the feasibility and the viability of building this mitigation, and also to confirm that the risk targets of the expert panel number 2 can be achieved with this mitigation in place. And that if those items can't be resolved, to reevaluate the preferred mitigation strategy at that point. So it's basically let's give an opportunity for this. It seems like it's the best option. There's an opportunity for third-party funding. Let's take this as far as we can go and see if it actually works. And if so, proceed with it, and if not, reevaluate. The following are rezoning conditions. These are just the hazard-related conditions. There are numerous other conditions not related to hazard. So first, it's to finalize debris flow modeling report and hazard maps, to enter into a licensing agreement with the developer for future debris flow model runs for both district and private use, to prepare a baseline, which means with no mitigation in place, quantitative risk assessment that establishes a risk to loss of life, to complete the detailed design of the mitigation, and that includes a number of conditions. This is sort of paraphrased, but securing all permitting approvals, land tenure for mitigation or for disposal sites of debris, preparing capital cost estimates and a funding plan, preparing operations and maintenance manuals and plans, as well as producing cost estimates for that and preparing a funding model, and to also prepare a post-event restoration plan. So after a large event happens, how do we clean it out? How do we make sure that we still have mitigation in place for downstream development? Then to complete a final quantitative risk assessment with the mitigation in place that shows that risk targets have been met, to register a Section 219 restrictive covenant specifying all the mitigation requirements and also certifying that risk targets have been met, and if necessary, that the developer would pay for any peer review for all of these above items. So the current status is that the developer's engineer, BGC Engineering, are advancing work on debris flow modeling, the quantitative risk assessment, and on the mitigation design. The district, developer, and the province have prepared a terms of reference, and we've appointed an independent expert review panel to assist with reviewing all of these different aspects of debris flow modeling, risk assessment, and mitigation design. The 3 members are Scott McDougall, he's a UBC professor with debris flow modeling and risk assessment expertise. Doug Van Dyne is an independent engineer with his own company who's been significantly involved in past Cheekye study, and he is a debris flow mitigation expert with decades of experience. And Nigel Skirmer is a large dam and design and construction expert, also with decades of experience. So we're in good hands with this panel. From a scheduling perspective, this is very preliminary, but at this stage we're looking to receive draft debris flow mapping and risk assessment results in early March, to start to see preliminary mitigation design in May, and then to take it from there, there's going to be long-term project coordination, determining detailed designs, securing land, permitting, all that through 2019 and beyond.
Questions? This is definitely going to be this council's decision coming up, so
prior to our new council taking office, the previous council dealt with an application from Black Tusk Helicopters. I wondered if you might comment if it has relevance to your storyline here, what exactly they applied for, and how it fits within the context of your presentation.
We can speak generally to what we
Yes.
do with applications that come in within the Cheekye plan.
So the existing policy poses challenges for development at the airport site. The new hazard mapping that's going to come out is going to provide us with updated information that will allow us to determine how to proceed with reviewing any development proposals at the airport. At this stage, we've been taking a precautionary approach. We have allowed some limited developments at the airport, subject to recommendations that were provided to the district by Bylaw. And so that incorporated basic mitigation measures and then also limiting the use of lands to make sure we're not creating habitable space or putting people in harm's way. So there's been sort of a precautionary approach, and I expect that when we have new debris flow mapping that we'll pretty quickly take that and create a new development policy.
Does that help? We've been very cautious thus far.
Just as follow-up, there are going to be proposals coming in the near future for development, and we'll refer to the OCP Chapter 14 in the preamble. There's a key word here, and that is for some industrial uses. This area is only available if area-wide debris flow hazard mitigation is implemented. Some is a key word. There's a lot of variation as to the kinds of developments being proposed. There's accessory sawmilling, plant being discussed, and wood waste handling, other kinds of activities. So this is an important question to achieve better clarity about. It's very important, this information that's coming forward. I'll just leave it at that.
Absolutely, thank you.
And just historically, the type of industrial uses that were promoted within the Cheekye fan were resource intensive. So the type of industry that doesn't require putting a lot of people, permanent residents or permanent employees, or require large buildings or infrastructure. So it was really trying to promote or reduce the number of people and the amount of infrastructure that would be located on the fan.
So I want to stay focused on our topic today, because as this data comes forward, Councillor Anderson will be able to then start to see what the implications are for freeing up land for industrial development and also possibly more residential development. But right now, we're trying to keep a hold on things and not freeze development where we see an opportunity. We have a decision before us tonight. It's a prime example of something that's sitting in the debris flow hazard zone. We get to make a judgment call tonight about whether that gets rezoned. But we are going to take a cautious approach till we have more information and a better idea of what is possible within the structure.
Can I just add, it just occurred to me that one bullet point we didn't put in that I think is, in my view, the most important, is that the expert review panel, when they looked at the current risk with our current knowledge, is that the risk level is currently in the unacceptable zone. So we are already unacceptable. So we talked about putting any more people in harm's way. That was the context of those decisions around the interim policy. And we will know more within months about, with more information and more mapping, and we'll revisit that.
Okay, any other questions? Great, thank you.
On to flood management and Diking.
Yeah, I don't think we're gonna get through our list today, but give it a shot.
Okay. These are some pictures that were taken just before Christmas of this year, or last year. So on the upper left there is at the Squamish Yacht Club. You can see that the ocean is basically flowing very close to downtown. That was within centimeters of overtopping Loggers Lane and Galbraith and entering into the downtown, really highlighting the need for coastal flood mitigation and sea diking. Bottom left is at Nexum Beach. We had quite a significant wind event that was occurred at the same time as a high tide with a pretty significant storm surge. And then on the right is the new sea deck that has been constructed at the Moreau and Sirocco developments. So this was a significant event, but it was a high tide, but it wasn't the highest tide. It was only, the tides can get about 0.8 meters higher. So there's a lot of discussion about how conservative the sea dike was at the Moreau and Sirocco development. There was about 2 meters of freeboard there. So if you add in a meter of sea level rise, and then that this event happened at an actual high tide, that freeboard starts to disappear pretty quickly. So, so the engineers were right. That's it. I'm not patting myself on the back. This is Colonel Glidell who gave us the recommendation. So quickly, I've discussed this in the past meeting. Squamish is exposed to significant flood hazards from coastal. Our downtown is within the coastal floodplain and areas to the north. Most of the development areas in town are exposed to flood hazards from our 5 river systems, and then we have debris flow hazard areas, the most notable being the Cheekye Development, and there's only a couple areas, Garibaldi Highlands and Crumpet Woods, Hospital Hill, they're actually outside of some sort of flood hazard zone. So significant flood hazards facing the community. We have a network of about 20 kilometers of dikes, most of which are on the Squamish and Mampcomb rivers. We also have the town dike, which is protecting downtown from coastal flooding. The dike along the Squamish River protecting Valley Cliff, and we also have some localized diking in the Paradise Valley that protects transportation infrastructure. These dikes are deficient in some areas for a variety of reasons, and significant upgrades have been identified through the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan. And of course, the reliability of our diking is becoming more and more important as more development is being put within the floodplain and also as climate change is taking place. So the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan recommended a prioritized dike upgrade program in order to correct our existing deficiencies, to build and improve a sea dike, and to adopt a higher standard of protection for the Squamish and Mampcomb River dikes, given the significant consequences of flooding within those floodplains. The cost estimate for this program is $85 million for district-wide projects. That does not include projects that would be constructed through private development. And so it was recommended that about $3.5 million per year would be required in order to complete those projects within a 25-year time frame. So the district, within our financial plan, has budgeted $2 million from municipal funding sources, and that we hope to subsidize or to build on that with an additional $2 million from grant funding. So we're budgeting $4 million per year within our 5-year financial plan, and intend to keep that in perpetuity moving forward. So these are really significant costs for a small municipality, and there is a need to prioritize, which is what the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan did. This is, I don't expect you to be able to see the individual projects, but this is a list of those projects that we're going to be doing over the next quarter century. The top 3 projects are improving the Squamish River Dike at Upper Judd Slough, which is a project that is underway and we've received grant funding for. The next highest priority project is building the sea dike to an interim elevation of 3.3 meters, which would provide us with a good level of protection for today's sea levels. And that includes building diking along Lot 1, or Wayneck Park downtown. And then finally to build and improve the dike at the Eagle Viewing area. So our 5-year capital plan is last year and this year to be working on the Squamish River Dike upgrade. We budgeted, or we have $6 million, so $4 million from last year with grant funding, and we have the $2 million from municipal funding in 2019. So a total of $6 million. We're also in the midst of completing a quantitative risk assessment for the Squamish River floodplain that is going to tell us risk to loss of life and also provide a cost-benefit analysis that is going to inform our dike upgrading program. It's possible that the results from that could modify the capital plan that I previously showed, so that's going to be a discussion that we'll be having within the next couple of months. I hope to bring that forward to Council in late February or early March. In 2020 and 2021, we hope to complete the Huaynik Park Sea Dike, which is estimated right now at $4 million. We're working on a grant application. I'll be seeking council support for that at a regular council meeting in the near future. And also to complete interim sea dike upgrades to 3.3 meters. So that requires some further scoping. We basically need to look at the full perimeter of our downtown and identify any areas that are below that 3.3 meters. We know some problem areas are Pemberton Avenue between Highway 99 and the CN rail tracks, and also near the Squamish Yacht Club. So we need to do a more detailed review and figure out exactly how to address those gaps. There are private land issues that are going to pose some significant issues, and land tenure is an issue, so that's going to be an ongoing project. We also hope to complete an eagle viewing area master plan. We've submitted a grant application for that and are awaiting response. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that on the later slide. And then in 2022 and 2023 to actually embark on dike upgrades for that area. So the project that we're doing right now is upgrading a 1 kilometer section of the Squamish River Dike in North Brackendale. So we're raising, widening it, and improving the erosion protection for that dike. We're also going to be completing a culvert restoration that reconnects the Squamish River with Upper Judd Slough. That will be through a gate that can be closed during flood conditions, but it would allow water to enter into and provide an environmental enhancement. That's a project that was identified by the Squamish Nation as part of our integrated flood hazard management plan. And we're also going to be completing a seismic assessment of that dike as part of this project. So this is not the end though. The integrated flood hazard management plan recommends that we upgrade ultimately to a 1 in 500 year standard. So at some point in the future, we will be going back here and doing some further raising. This is just to get it to the provincial standard dike status. Moving into 2020 and 2021, the Huaynik Park Sea Dike, shown here. Some design considerations are that the integrated flood hazard management plan identified the Mamcombe Blind Channel through downtown to be a vertical seawall due to the limited land base that, of the parcels that are upland of that sea dike. So if we're looking at different types of dike, we may not actually have the space to do that, or we may require further encroachment into the Mamcombe Blind Channel. We would incorporate environmental enhancement and marine habitat improvements as part of that. There's various measures that can be taken into consideration in the design phase. We should also be considering the future land use of the park as part of the sea dike design. And we recognize that council and community input will be required at the concept phase of developing that. So we'll probably begin those types of discussions in late 2019 or early 2020 before we get into detailed design.
On the last point regarding input, that will of course involve the neighboring landowner. What type of consultation would be involved there with the neighboring landowner on this dike design?
Specifically, are you referring to the Squamish Yacht Club or to the development?
Keith Scott.
We haven't prepared a public consultation plan at this stage, but certainly we would be in conversations with any relevant landowners or the community at large to get feedback. Certainly we want to know what plans there are for the Squamish Yacht Club and to be able to incorporate their plans with our sea dike design, but we haven't taken it any further than that in terms of determining exactly how we'll consult.
So an engagement plan will be prepared as per IATT.
Yes.
Thank you.
Correct. And then moving into the eagle viewing area, just to highlight some of the considerations and challenges. You can see here we have very limited space. The dike is sandwiched between the river and Government Road. There are land tenure issues. Land in this area is through municipal, Crown, Squamish Nation, and private land use. So there's a lot of different land tenure issues that need to be resolved. There's a significant amount of existing development. It includes the trailer park on the CHA Reserve, the Watershed Grill, and then there's private homes as well behind the dike. A significant amount of infrastructure, including the Dryden Creek Pump Station, Government Road. So there's just a lot of challenges as to how we're going to raise and widen this dike, taking all of this into consideration. There's also future objectives, so development objectives for the Squamish Nation or for private landowners or the district, as well as tourism needs for the eagle viewing area. And so with all of these different challenges, it's been recommended through the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan to prepare a master plan for the area, and that would be through a consultation process with the Squamish Nation and public and council in order to determine how are we going to upgrade the dike in this area and accommodate all of the various objectives. That's it.
Questions, council? Councilor
During the discussions around the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan, I seem to recall some council discussion about whether or not the amount that dikes were being raised was too onerous on developers and so on. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to, especially in the context we've seen the impacts of climate change sort of exceed the most pessimistic predictions. So do we need to be reevaluating the flood hazard management plan sooner rather than later, or is it pretty solid in your opinion right now? And also sort of thinking in terms of that picture in front of Sirocco and stuff. Can I ask that?
So the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan recommended that it be upgraded every 10 years, or if there's new provincial guidance with respect to climate change, that we would take that into consideration. So right now the provincial guidance is to plan for 1 meter of sea level rise and also to increase the peak flow of our rivers by 10%. That hasn't changed, and so we're still current with respect to the best science put out by the provincial government. But if at some point in the future they say you should be taking into account larger sea level rise or larger peak flows in our rivers, that would likely be a trigger for updating the plan. And right now, the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan requires that parcels that are rezoning adjacent to the planned sea dike or adjacent to the Squamish or Mamcon River dike, that they be required to upgrade their frontage to incorporate 1 meter of sea level rise, or to upgrade to the 1 in 500 year standard. So right now we're taking quite a precautious, prudent approach with respect to requiring developers to upgrade their section of dike.
So I have to tell you, on Christmas morning, at about 8:30, was the year's highest tide. 16.4 feet at Point Atkinson, which is about 16.8 feet in Squamish. And it was a clear day still, no storm systems. And I went down and checked the tide. And just for reference, at the Nexon Beach, with the lock blocks there, it comes up to the seam between the two lock blocks. And that's with still water, no wind, no storm, or anything like that. At the yacht club, it's about a meter, almost a meter below grade. So the storm surge that you see there, when the yacht club floods, that's the impact of storm surge. It adds about a meter. And that would, if you notice that picture of the yacht club parking lot, that's without local wind. It's not necessarily always local wind driven. That's because of activities in the Strait of Georgia and air pressure. So I had to tell you that.
Thank you.
That was my Christmas morning.
Yeah, we got lucky with that storm.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, we have a lot of money to spend. Councillor Anderson?
I just wondered if I missed it in your slide concerning the eagle viewing dike as to scenarios for timeline of exploring those issues relating to that site. Did you include a timeline or a scenario for when we might be approaching these issues?
Yeah, so
Or
I'll just back to this one. Yeah, so we're looking.
22, 23.
Yeah, the eagle viewing master plan, we hope to do next year. So
I
we
see.
can do that in advance. That's probably going to be a one-year process. And then that would be in place prior to actually completing.
So we
deck
may see an
upgrades.
eagle viewing area master plan come forward in budget. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Councilor Race.
And one other brief thing, my recollection is that the dike that we see being built in front of Mistral, or built now in Shirako, has the ability to be raised a meter, am I correct in stating that? To accommodate things like future climate, future sea level rise and so forth.
That's correct.
So that's not the final height necessarily.
Yeah, so the dike was built to withstand 1 meter of sea level rise, but we also required that the applicant demonstrate that they could take into account up to 2 meter sea level rise. And so basically on their design drawings, they showed that it's possible to weld some additional sheets on top of the existing sheet pile to raise it another meter.
Discouraging to think that even might transport. Okay, any other questions on Diking? Okay, I want to move the last 2 items to another committee of the whole, just to allow for enough time for our closed meeting portion and give everyone a break for dinner before the special meeting tonight. So I'm going to defer the Woodfibre verbal update and the average speed over distance. Thank you for your presentation. And motion to close, please. Moved by Councilor French, second by Councilor Race. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries.